It all began on a quiet evening in Los Angeles, a city that thrives on fame, fortune, and secrets carefully hidden behind manicured gates and velvet ropes. Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, had spent years navigating a life under constant scrutiny, where every smile, every movement, and every word could be dissected by millions worldwide. The world saw her as a picture of elegance and confidence, a woman who had stepped from Hollywood glamour into royal tradition with poise and ambition. Yet behind the perfectly curated Instagram photos, the meticulously staged appearances, and the carefully crafted public image, there was a private world, unseen, unreported, and perhaps more complex than anyone could imagine. For years, Meghan and Prince Harry had captivated global attention. Their love story, at first, seemed like a modern fairy tale. A prince, breaking royal convention, finding his equal in a woman who had carved her own path in Hollywood, confident, independent, and determined. The public adored them, media outlets swooned over every engagement, and their every step seemed choreographed to perfection. But even in the midst of adoration and fascination, cracks were beginning to form in a relationship that many believed was invincible. Rumors circulated, whispers grew louder, and sources close to the couple hinted at tensions that were anything but superficial. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What no one knew, until recently, was that these tensions had escalated far beyond ordinary disagreements. Meghan, it seems, had been wrestling with a storm of emotions, desires, and temptations that threatened to upend not just her marriage but the perception of her as a dutiful duchess. At the heart of this emerging storm was a figure who had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. An Arab billionaire, whose name alone could conjure images of wealth beyond comprehension, of power that bends realities, and of a fascination with the unattainable. His interest in Meghan was no casual intrigue. Sources suggest it was a relentless pursuit, an obsession, an attempt to draw her into a world of possibilities far removed from her royal duties and her life with Harry. Imagine, for a moment, the weight of such a decision. On one hand, there is a man she had chosen, a life intertwined with a history she could not ignore, and a global audience watching every step. On the other hand, there is a man who represents freedom, indulgence, and perhaps the fulfillment of ambitions she has held close but seldom voiced. What would you do if presented with a choice that could change everything? That was the very question Meghan had to grapple with in silence, behind palace doors, in private conversations with friends, and within the quiet moments of her own reflection. The intrigue began subtly. At first, it was mere curiosity, the occasional message, discreet overtures, and subtle gestures meant to capture attention. But over time, the billionaire's interest became more pronounced, more assertive, and impossible to ignore. There were whispers of lavish gifts, invitations to private, exotic locations, and promises of experiences that few could even imagine. For Meghan, accustomed to attention and accustomed to navigating influence, this was a test of loyalty, desire, and personal resolve. Would she adhere to the life she had chosen with Harry, or would she allow herself to be swayed by temptation that arrived with a gilded invitation and the allure of a life unbound? While the world remained captivated by the images of their public appearances, Meghan's inner world was far more turbulent. Friends and insiders describe late-night conversations where doubts were laid bare, where she spoke candidly about the pressures of her role, the weight of public expectation, and the longing for a sense of freedom she felt increasingly deprived of. These confessions, often whispered and shared in secrecy, reveal a woman wrestling with profound conflict. The love for Harry remained, yet alongside it was a growing awareness of a life that could be different, one less constrained by protocol, less scrutinized by cameras, and more attuned to her personal desires and ambitions. Meanwhile, Harry himself was not blind to the changes in their relationship. Reports suggest that he sensed a shift in Meghan's demeanor, an emotional distance that he could not easily bridge. Attempts to reconnect, to reassure, and to communicate were reportedly met with a mixture of warmth and withdrawal, creating a complicated dance of emotions that few could understand. The palace walls, once thought to be impenetrable to personal strife, now held echoes of tension, quiet frustrations, and the silent acknowledgement that something significant was unfolding, something that could not be contained by appearances alone. Compounding the drama was the inevitable intrusion of media speculation. Every gesture, every comment, and every public appearance was analyzed for signs of discontent. Social media buzzed with theories, tabloids speculated on potential affairs or conflicts, and fans dissected the couple's every move. For Meghan, this was not just invasive, it was exhausting. The constant scrutiny magnified her internal struggle, turning personal decisions into public debates and private reflections into headline material. The stakes were no longer simply personal, they were global. It was within this charged atmosphere that the billionaire's pursuit intensified. Sources close to Meghan suggest that he began orchestrating high-profile, high-risk gestures aimed directly at capturing her attention. Private meetings, invitations to luxurious retreats, and carefully timed gifts created a narrative of undeniable allure and temptation. For Meghan, these gestures were impossible to ignore. They represented not only the thrill of being desired in a world outside the royal spotlight, but also the promise of experiences that contrasted sharply with her regimented, protocol-driven life. And yet, despite the seduction of wealth and excitement, Meghan's conflict was profound. She was torn between loyalty and desire, between duty and personal fulfillment, and between the life she had chosen publicly and the life she could imagine privately. Every decision carried weight, every moment of reflection carried consequence, and every choice risked the judgment of a world that watched intently. What makes this story even more compelling is the sheer intensity of these private deliberations, the silent, emotional battles waged in the hidden corners of her life, away from cameras, advisors, and public scrutiny. Friends recount moments of quiet despair, moments when Meghan reportedly questioned the meaning of her choices, the sustainability of her public image, and the reality of her personal happiness. These were not trivial concerns. They were existential, a deep reckoning with what it meant to be loved, to be admired, and to be free within the confines of a life that had already been dramatically transformed by global attention. For those who witnessed these conversations, the emotional intensity was palpable, a storm of feeling barely contained within the glamorous veneer of her public persona. At the same time, Harry's position was equally precarious. He had committed his life to Meghan, defied tradition to marry her, and shared with her a vision of mutual support and partnership. Yet, the increasing presence of a billionaire suitor, combined with Meghan's growing ambivalence, threatened not only the stability of their marriage, but also Harry's own sense of trust and identity. Reports suggest that he oscillated between confrontation, compassion, and attempts to salvage the intimacy and connection that had initially defined their relationship. The emotional complexity was staggering, love entangled with betrayal, desire intertwined with loyalty, and public image colliding with private truth. The culmination of these tensions set the stage for a dramatic revelation that would shock friends, insiders, and potentially the global audience. Meghan, sources allege, reached a point where she admitted to herself, and perhaps to those she trusted most, that the possibility of leaving Harry was no longer a distant fantasy, but a tangible consideration. The weight of this admission, coupled with the persistent pursuit of the billionaire, created a combustible mix of secrecy, temptation, and ethical conflict. It is within this charged moment that the story truly begins, a narrative not only of love and desire, but of power, ambition, and the human struggle to reconcile personal fulfillment with duty and expectation. As we explore the unfolding drama, it is essential to understand that this is more than a tale of celebrity gossip or royal intrigue. It is a story of human emotion laid bare, the struggle between heart and mind, between public persona and private reality, and between the allure of the unknown and the comfort of the familiar. The decisions made in these private spaces carry consequences far beyond the individuals involved. They ripple outward, affecting families, institutions, and the very perception of those who inhabit positions of extraordinary visibility. In the chapters to follow, we will delve into every facet of this story: the billionaire's methods, Meghan's emotional journey, Harry's private struggles, and the subtle yet powerful influence of media and public scrutiny. We will examine first-hand accounts, expert analyses, and the intricate interplay of desire, duty, and reputation. Every moment, every choice, and every reaction will be explored with the depth and nuance that this situation demands, offering a panoramic view of a drama that has captivated, confused, and enthralled observers around the world. From quiet conversations in private rooms to high-profile events where every glance and gesture is interpreted, this story unfolds like a chess game played with human emotion at its core. The moves are calculated, the stakes are high, and the consequences are unpredictable. As viewers, you are invited to witness the intimate moments that rarely reach the public eye, to understand the pressures, temptations, and decisions that define a life lived under scrutiny, and to grapple with questions that resonate far beyond celebrity culture. What would you do if every choice you made was examined, judged, and potentially manipulated by forces beyond your control? It began subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Los Angeles, with its glimmering skyline and relentless pulse of wealth, had always been a city where ambition and desire collided. Meghan Markle had become no stranger to its rhythms. She moved through its neighborhoods and events with the grace of someone who had learned to navigate attention, favor, and scrutiny with precision. Yet even in this familiar environment, a new presence arrived, someone whose wealth, influence, and allure demanded notice. The Arab billionaire, whose name had begun to circulate quietly in elite circles, was not the type of figure one could easily ignore. Sources describe him as magnetic, enigmatic, and persistent, a man who understood the power of desire and the subtle art of pursuit. His first overtures were calculated, not reckless. Meghan, accustomed to the attention of Hollywood and royalty alike, initially dismissed the gestures as curiosity or casual interest. There were private messages, carefully worded to pique interest without crossing boundaries. Invitations arrived to luxurious settings, carefully orchestrated to provide both comfort and exclusivity. Every detail was intended to capture attention while offering a glimpse of a life that seemed tantalizingly out of reach. Yet even as the invitations came, Meghan's mind was already occupied by the life she shared with Prince Harry, a life steeped in history, duty, and public expectation. But the allure of the billionaire was not simply material. It was the promise of possibility, of experiences untethered by protocol or tradition, that created tension within Meghan. Insiders describe a woman who had always been ambitious, creative, and independent, traits that had drawn Harry in initially, and now found herself facing a test of loyalty and self-interest. The tension was emotional, intellectual, and moral all at once. Every message, every encounter, seemed to pose a question she could not easily answer. What did she truly want, and how far was she willing to go to achieve it? It was not long before the pursuit intensified. The billionaire's team, skilled in the nuances of influence and persuasion, orchestrated encounters designed to be memorable, disarming, and irresistible. Private dinners, secluded retreats, and the subtle presentation of gifts that reflected an understanding of her tastes were all part of a meticulous strategy. The goal was clear: to create a connection that was impossible to ignore, a gravitational pull toward a life that was both luxurious and unpredictable. Meghan, for her part, was deeply aware of the stakes. She had built a life alongside Harry that was already fraught with external pressures, the media scrutiny, the expectations of the royal family, and the ever-present public gaze. Every move she made could be interpreted, judged, and magnified, turning private feelings into public spectacle. Yet the tension between desire and duty is rarely linear or simple. Sources close to Meghan recount late-night conversations where she wrestled with feelings of guilt, curiosity, and temptation, acknowledging the appeal of a life that could offer freedom and adventure beyond the confines of her current existence. Harry's awareness of the situation grew incrementally. At first, he sensed subtle changes, a distracted demeanor, fleeting moments of detachment, and occasional emotional distance. For a man who had devoted himself to partnership and loyalty, these signs were alarming. Attempts to communicate, to reassure, and to reconnect were met with a mixture of warmth and guarded withdrawal, creating an emotional labyrinth that he struggled to navigate. Their once predictable and loving routines were now punctuated by unspoken tension and quiet reflection. each party cautiously testing the boundaries of conversation and emotional engagement. Friends and insiders describe a particularly striking moment during a private retreat in Malibu. Meghan, caught in a vulnerable emotional state, confided in a close friend about the intensity of the billionaire's pursuit and the impact it was having on her mental and emotional well-being. She spoke candidly about the allure of wealth, the seduction of freedom, and the subtle but persistent questioning of her own desires. The confession was raw, revealing a woman torn between loyalty to Harry and a burgeoning curiosity about the possibilities that lay beyond the walls of her current life. Meanwhile, the billionaire's strategy remained relentless yet refined. There were rumors of luxury trips offered under the guise of philanthropy, invitations to high-profile art exhibits and social events, and discreet gestures meant to convey attention without intrusion. Each move was carefully calculated to create intimacy while respecting the public visibility of Meghan's life. Insiders suggest that he understood the psychological nuances at play, the thrill of being desired, the temptation of exclusivity, and the subtle pressure of having someone invest so heavily in one's attention and interest. The stakes were heightened by Meghan's own awareness of her public image. She had cultivated a persona of sophistication, independence, and moral clarity, one that had helped her navigate the treacherous waters of Hollywood and royalty alike. Yet behind that carefully constructed image was a private self, one that yearned for authenticity, adventure, and connection unbound by expectation. The tension between these selves, the public figure and the private woman, intensified under the shadow of the billionaire's pursuit. Even the smallest interactions became charged with meaning. A seemingly innocuous message, a casual encounter at an event, or a compliment offered in private could be interpreted in multiple ways, creating layers of emotional complexity. Sources indicate that Meghan oscillated between intrigue, guilt, and curiosity, each emotional swing magnified by the constant presence of public scrutiny. What made the situation particularly precarious was the realization that her choices, once private, could easily become public knowledge, amplifying the consequences of any decision she might make. As weeks turned into months, the billionaire's influence grew. Friends noticed subtle shifts in Meghan's behavior, increased contemplation, a heightened awareness of personal appearance, and moments of distraction even during public engagements with Harry. These changes, while perhaps innocuous in isolation, painted a broader picture of an emotional struggle that was escalating in intensity. It was a struggle that combined desire, opportunity, and the human instinct to explore what might be possible outside the confines of current commitments. Harry, in response, attempted to anchor the relationship. Private conversations aimed to reaffirm love, partnership, and commitment became increasingly necessary. Yet the very intensity of Meghan's internal conflict created a barrier that was difficult to breach. Insiders described moments of emotional confrontation where Harry sought clarity, only to be met with evasive responses or guarded expressions, a dance of honesty and concealment that reflected the complex dynamics at play. The media, ever vigilant, began to sense tension. Subtle shifts in public appearances, fleeting expressions during high-profile engagements, and carefully worded interviews became fodder for speculation. Headlines suggested disagreement, discontent, and possible estrangement, though much of the truth remained hidden behind closed doors. Meghan's struggle, deeply personal and emotionally charged, was now intersecting with a global audience eager to interpret every gesture and statement. It was against this backdrop of tension, temptation, and public scrutiny that the true emotional weight of the situation became apparent. Meghan's consideration of leaving Harry was no longer hypothetical. It was an emerging reality, fueled by desire, opportunity, and the relentless pursuit of the billionaire. Each private decision, each moment of introspection, carried the potential to reshape not only her life but the perception of the couple as a whole. As we move deeper into this story, the stakes will only intensify. The chapters ahead will explore the billionaire's escalating pursuit, Meghan's internal deliberations, Harry's emotional response, and the ways in which external pressures, media, public, and familial, intersected with deeply personal choices. We will examine the human dimension of this drama, uncovering the motivations, fears, and desires that define a situation as emotionally volatile as it is captivating. The story is far from over, and the consequences of every decision will ripple outward, touching relationships, reputations, and the very perception of loyalty, desire, and personal fulfillment in a life lived under scrutiny. The story intensified as the Arab billionaire recognized the subtle shifts in Meghan's behavior and decided to escalate his approach. Unlike many who would rely purely on wealth to impress, he understood the intricate dance required to capture the attention of someone constantly in the public eye, someone whose life was already enmeshed with royalty and global scrutiny. His strategy was not just about showing opulence. It was about creating an environment in which Meghan could feel seen, desired, and understood, in ways that contrasted sharply with the life she had built with Prince Harry. Sources close to the billionaire describe him as meticulous, a master of perception and timing. He observed Meghan's routines, her habits, and her subtle responses to attention. Invitations to exclusive events were tailored to her personal interests, whether it was a private viewing of a rare art collection or an intimate gathering of influential figures in sectors she cared deeply about. Every move was carefully considered to reinforce a sense of exclusivity, of being chosen and recognized in ways that no one else could provide. One of the first major steps in this strategic pursuit involved arranging a retreat in a secluded, luxurious villa along the Mediterranean. Meghan, initially hesitant, found herself drawn in not by the grandeur but by the meticulous attention to detail. The itinerary balanced adventure with moments of quiet reflection, and each gesture, from the selection of literature in the villa's library to the curated culinary experiences, was designed to resonate with her personal tastes. Friends described Meghan's reaction as a mixture of astonishment and intrigue, emotions that were increasingly difficult to reconcile with her loyalty to Harry. During these moments, Meghan's inner conflict became more pronounced. Insiders recount late-night conversations where she expressed both fascination and guilt, reflecting on how unusual it was to feel so torn between a current life and the possibilities of an alternative path. The allure of the billionaire's world was compelling, not just in terms of luxury, but in the freedom it implied. It was a life without constant media scrutiny, a life where her decisions could be her own without immediate judgment. Yet it also represented risk, uncertainty, and profound ethical questions. Harry, meanwhile, began sensing a growing distance. His attempts to engage Meghan in meaningful conversations were met with polite attention, but subtle emotional withdrawal. There were moments when Meghan seemed fully present, laughing at his humor and sharing memories. Yet these moments were punctuated by periods of introspection, where her mind appeared elsewhere, absorbed in the allure of what she had glimpsed through the billionaire's gestures. The dynamic between them shifted, no longer the straightforward partnership it had once been, but a careful negotiation of attention, emotion, and trust. The billionaire's team worked tirelessly to maintain a balance of persistence and discretion. It was crucial that Meghan felt both desire and autonomy, that she did not perceive herself as being pressured, but rather gently guided toward engagement. Each message, each invitation, was carefully timed. A private call discussing shared interests would be followed days later by an unexpected personal gesture, reinforcing a sense of genuine connection. Observers described these moves as psychologically sophisticated, designed to stimulate curiosity, appreciation, and emotional attachment without overt coercion. This calculated pursuit soon began to intersect with Meghan's professional endeavors. Invitations to philanthropic events, speaking engagements, and high-profile social gatherings were extended in ways that highlighted her influence and personal achievements. In these settings, she was celebrated, admired, and, crucially, treated as a central figure rather than a supporting spouse. Sources suggest that these experiences offered Meghan a glimpse of a life where her ambitions and desires could be prioritized in ways that her existing role with Harry often constrained. Yet the billionaire's influence was not purely external. He sought to create an emotional resonance, a sense of being understood on a level that was deeply personal. Conversations were crafted to reflect empathy, insight, and attentiveness to Meghan's experiences, both past and present. Insider accounts indicate that these interactions were powerful precisely because they addressed her needs for recognition, validation, and emotional intimacy. Needs that, despite the closeness she shared with Harry, were momentarily amplified by the novelty and attentiveness of a new connection. The emotional intensity of this period cannot be overstated. Meghan reportedly oscillated between excitement and anxiety, curiosity and guilt, longing and loyalty. Friends describe moments where she appeared lost in thought, pondering the implications of choice, desire, and self-determination. The tension between her public image and private desires grew sharper, and the question of whether she could reconcile these aspects of herself became increasingly urgent. Meanwhile, Harry's concerns grew. He had noticed subtle changes in Meghan's routines, a newfound preoccupation with messages and calls, and fleeting expressions that betrayed a depth of contemplation beyond the ordinary. Attempts at candid conversation were often met with measured responses, leaving him uncertain about the emotional landscape they now shared. Friends of the couple described tense moments where Harry confronted Meghan gently but directly, seeking reassurance, clarity, and affirmation of commitment, only to be met with nuanced evasions or guarded honesty, the emotional equivalent of a door half closed. Public appearances began to reflect these private tensions. Observers noted that Meghan's demeanor, once radiant and open, occasionally bore traces of distraction or emotional weight. The press, ever vigilant, speculated on minor inconsistencies in behavior, projecting narratives of discontent and strain. While much of this remained speculative, the underlying emotional reality was complex. Meghan was navigating a delicate interplay of loyalty, curiosity, desire, and public expectation, all while under the global gaze that never allowed for private mistakes or introspection. The billionaire's strategy adapted accordingly. Recognizing that overt persistence could create resistance, he leaned into subtlety and psychological nuance. Small acts of thoughtfulness, a personal note, a carefully chosen gift, an unexpected phone call to discuss her passions, were magnified by Meghan's emotional receptivity. Sources note that these gestures, while seemingly minor, created cumulative emotional impact, deepening intrigue and testing the boundaries of loyalty. It was during this period that Meghan reportedly began to articulate, even privately, a willingness to consider what her life might look like if she allowed herself to explore beyond Harry. Friends describe her grappling with questions of identity, autonomy, and fulfillment. What would it mean to pursue personal happiness at potential cost to existing commitments? Could she reconcile duty with desire? And, perhaps most importantly, could she maintain her sense of self while navigating the treacherous waters of fame, expectation, and wealth? As weeks progressed, the tension reached a palpable peak. Each encounter with the billionaire, each carefully crafted message, each display of attentiveness, intensified Meghan's internal conflict. The questions she faced were no longer abstract. They were pressing, emotionally urgent, and morally complex. Every choice, every fleeting moment of connection, carried consequences that could reshape her life, Harry's life, and the public perception of them both. The chapter closes with a critical understanding. The pursuit was no longer a subtle undercurrent, but a significant force in Meghan's life, one that demanded attention, reflection, and emotional negotiation. The billionaire's strategy had succeeded in creating a compelling alternative, one that was both alluring and challenging, complex and emotionally potent. The stage was set for decisions, confrontations, and revelations that would test the boundaries of loyalty, love, and desire in ways that would reverberate far beyond private lives into public consciousness. As the days turned into weeks, Meghan's emotional landscape grew increasingly complex, a storm of desire, doubt, and reflection that seemed almost impossible to navigate. The presence of the Arab billionaire in her life had started subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, like a ripple across a still pond. Yet over time, the ripples became waves, crashing against the shores of her mind and heart, shaking the foundations of a life she had once thought unshakable. Friends close to Meghan observed changes in her demeanor that were subtle but unmistakable. She began spending longer hours in private reflection, sometimes retreating to quiet corners of her home or villa, her gaze distant and unfocused. These were not moments of idle thought, but periods of intense inner debate, as if she were weighing every aspect of her life, every commitment, every promise, and every desire against one another. The core of Meghan's internal struggle centered on loyalty and longing, two forces often at odds. Her relationship with Prince Harry, though deeply rooted in shared experiences and affection, now faced the strain of absence, not just physical, but emotional. She found herself questioning whether the partnership that had once felt like a refuge could accommodate her evolving desires. Could the love she felt coexist with the curiosity that had been ignited by the billionaire's attention? Could she remain faithful to the life she had built while exploring the possibilities of a life she had only glimpsed in fleeting encounters? The billionaire's influence, while deliberate, was never overtly manipulative. Instead, it was calibrated to elicit thought, curiosity, and emotional responsiveness. Personal messages arrived at unexpected times, filled with references to shared interests, intellectual discussions, and subtle compliments that recognized aspects of Meghan she felt were often overlooked. Each interaction was designed to provoke reflection, to make her consider the life she led and the alternative she could imagine, a life where attention, admiration, and autonomy were not fleeting but consistently present. One particularly telling moment occurred during a private evening at a secluded villa, where the conversation drifted from art to literature, then seamlessly into more personal terrain: aspirations, fears, regrets, and dreams. Meghan reportedly found herself opening up in ways she had rarely done, expressing vulnerabilities and ambitions with a candor that left her both exhilarated and conflicted. The billionaire listened with attentiveness that contrasted sharply with her experiences in the public eye, where scrutiny often overshadowed genuine empathy. During this period, Meghan's sense of self began to shift in nuanced ways. She started to question the limitations she had unconsciously imposed on herself, the compromises made in deference to expectation, and the boundaries of personal freedom within her marriage. Emotional tension intensified as she grappled with questions that had no easy answers. What was owed to Harry, to herself, and to the image she maintained in the public sphere? How much of her loyalty was rooted in love, and how much in fear? Fear of judgment, scandal, or the unknown consequences of choice? Meanwhile, Prince Harry noticed the subtle changes and could not ignore them. Observers note that he attempted to engage Meghan with openness, humor, and warmth, striving to maintain the emotional intimacy they had cultivated over years. Yet his efforts were met with an emotional oscillation that he struggled to interpret. At times, Meghan appeared fully present, sharing laughter and vulnerability. At other moments, a veil of distraction or distance would descend, leaving him uncertain of her focus, her feelings, and her intentions. This uncertainty fueled his own anxiety, creating a feedback loop of tension that further complicated their interactions. Friends describe private conversations where Meghan voiced her inner conflict with raw honesty. She spoke of longing for recognition, understanding, and space to explore her own ambitions without judgment. She questioned the sustainability of a life constrained by expectation, protocol, and the relentless gaze of media scrutiny. Yet alongside these thoughts was an undeniable awareness of the potential fallout: emotional, relational, and public. The stakes were immense, and every contemplation carried weight far beyond personal desire. As these dynamics unfolded, the billionaire continued to maintain a delicate balance between presence and discretion. He avoided overt pressure, allowing Meghan to arrive at her own conclusions while ensuring that she felt a growing emotional resonance and sense of possibility. His gestures, both material and emotional, were synchronized with her psychological rhythms, fostering moments of introspection that could not be easily dismissed. This careful orchestration began to manifest in Meghan's day-to-day life. She noticed how her emotional responsiveness shifted depending on context. Private interactions with the billionaire sparked intrigue and anticipation, while public and personal interactions with Harry carried a mixture of affection and subtle tension. The contrasts highlighted not only her desires, but also the complexity of her loyalties, forcing her to confront questions she had long avoided or rationalized away. Compounding her inner conflict were whispers and subtle influences from the broader social environment. Media speculation, palace insiders, and public scrutiny created an almost suffocating backdrop to her personal deliberations. Meghan had to navigate not only her private emotions, but also the expectations of a world eager to interpret, judge, and sensationalize her every move. In this atmosphere, even private reflections were tinged with concern for perception, magnifying the intensity of her decision-making process. During this period, Meghan's thoughts often returned to the notion of autonomy. She began to imagine scenarios in which she could pursue personal fulfillment without constraint, where choice and desire could coexist without compromise. These imaginings were not fleeting daydreams, but detailed mental constructions of alternative realities, each with its own set of challenges, rewards, and emotional consequences. She reflected on what it might mean to follow desire without betraying the core of her identity, to reconcile longing with loyalty, and to navigate ethical complexities in a world that observed every step. The chapter of Meghan's growing doubt and emotional turmoil closed with a heightened sense of tension, a pivotal juncture where contemplation was nearing decision. The cumulative weight of longing, curiosity, autonomy, and moral questioning created a fertile ground for transformation. Every gesture, every conversation, every moment of introspection carried amplified significance. The emotional stage was set for a confrontation, not just with the billionaire, not just with Harry, but with herself. Decisions made here would reverberate through relationships, reputations, and personal identity, signaling a shift from contemplation to action. By the time Meghan's emotional tension had reached a boiling point, the cracks in her marriage to Prince Harry had begun to manifest in ways that were both subtle and unmistakable. These fractures were not born of overt conflict or explosive arguments, at least not in the public eye, but rather through the quiet accumulation of distance, unspoken doubts, and unshared emotional burdens. Observers close to the couple described a delicate but increasingly strained equilibrium, one where appearances were maintained while private truths quietly eroded the foundation beneath them. Harry, for his part, remained committed to preserving the relationship. Friends reported that he made deliberate efforts to maintain closeness, scheduling private dinners, long walks, and intimate conversations designed to reinforce their bond. Yet even his most well-intentioned actions were increasingly met with nuanced resistance. Meghan's mind, often elsewhere, traced alternative scenarios and imagined paths that increasingly involved the billionaire. Though she did not act on these thoughts openly, the psychological distance became palpable, affecting the subtle rhythms of communication, mutual decision-making, and emotional reciprocity. One area where the strain became evident was in public appearances, a domain in which the couple had previously excelled. Meghan, once effervescent and engaging during royal events, now exhibited moments of distraction. A fleeting hesitation during a speech, a delayed response to a well-meaning joke, or a brief lapse in eye contact. These seemingly minor gestures were noted by insiders and interpreted as signs of emotional preoccupation. While the public might have dismissed them as simple fatigue or human imperfection, for those within their circle, these cues marked the emergence of deeper unrest. Experts in relationship psychology observing similar dynamics note that such late-night confessions often serve multiple functions. They act as cathartic release, a testing ground for emotional fidelity, and a reflective mechanism for assessing personal desires against ethical or relational obligations. Meghan's conversations, as described by friends and insiders, reflected all of these elements. They were simultaneously exploratory and evaluative, offering both insight and tension as she navigated the conflicting pressures of attraction, duty, and self-actualization. By the close of this period, the late-night dialogues had begun to shape the trajectory of their relationship in meaningful ways. Meghan's emotional honesty, even when partial or tentative, illuminated the latent complexities of her attachment, curiosity, and aspirations. Harry's engagement, though patient and supportive, revealed the challenge of sustaining intimacy in a landscape increasingly defined by uncertainty. The groundwork was laid for critical decisions that would soon test the boundaries of loyalty, commitment, and personal fulfillment, foreshadowing the imminent intensification of both internal and relational pressures. The chapter concludes with a palpable sense of anticipation, an emotional crescendo in which the private landscape of longing, doubt, and reflection intersects with the external forces of influence, expectation, and desire. The late-night confessions were no longer merely private exchanges. They had become the crucible in which future actions, decisions, and revelations would be forged, setting the stage for the next, decisive chapter in the unfolding drama. Life in the public eye is a double-edged sword, and for Meghan and Harry, the balance had long tipped toward relentless exposure. Every movement, expression, and utterance was subject to scrutiny, not just from tabloids and social media, but from the global audience invested in their every choice. The glare of attention, once perhaps a novelty or even a source of validation, had transformed into a persistent pressure that amplified existing tensions. Observers noted that high-profile couples often experience stressors invisible to the outside world: the constant need to curate appearances, the inability to retreat fully into private life, and the pervasive awareness that every decision is both symbolic and performative. For Meghan, these forces converged at a particularly vulnerable moment, intersecting with the subtle influence of the billionaire and her emerging internal conflicts. Public scrutiny permeated every aspect of their lives, from ceremonial duties to casual appearances. Meghan found that her actions, whether in charity engagements or social commentary, were dissected with precision, often reframed in ways that magnified minor missteps into perceived controversies. Headlines painted narratives that were sometimes entirely speculative, yet their repetition created a sense of reality, a social pressure that could not be ignored. The constant negotiation of image, expectation, and authenticity became a source of fatigue and emotional strain. Harry, meanwhile, struggled to shield her without appearing controlling, attempting to navigate the complex interplay of protection and respect for agency. Social media, in particular, served as both a window and a mirror, allowing instant feedback but reflecting opinions amplified by virality and sensationalism. Every post, comment, or photograph carried the potential to trigger waves of interpretation, often detached from context. Friends close to Meghan described moments in which she would read threads late at night, her reactions ranging from irritation to profound frustration, a mixture of empathy for misunderstood narratives and awareness of the impossibility of controlling perception. The exposure heightened her desire for spaces where her identity could be acknowledged without distortion, making the attentiveness and understanding from the billionaire all the more psychologically resonant. Public scrutiny was not only external but also relational. Within royal circles and social networks, subtle judgments, comparisons, and assumptions created a climate where Meghan's decisions were constantly measured against precedent, tradition, and expectation. Advisors and peers, consciously or unconsciously, reinforced notions of propriety and loyalty, often interpreting her actions through the lens of established norms rather than personal desire. This environment generated an ongoing tension between autonomy and conformity, shaping both self-perception and decision-making. Observers noted that such dynamics are particularly potent for individuals navigating dual identities, public figure and private self, where misalignment can generate anxiety, doubt, and a heightened sense of isolation. As scrutiny intensified, so did the couple's private discussions about boundaries and coping strategies. Meghan and Harry developed a complex system of negotiation around visibility, interaction, and personal space, yet the sheer magnitude of external attention often rendered these strategies insufficient. Friends recalled instances where the pressure manifested physically and emotionally: sleepless nights, terse exchanges, and moments of withdrawal in which either partner sought reprieve from constant observation. These patterns reflected a broader challenge faced by high-profile individuals: sustaining intimate connection while negotiating the persistent gaze of a global audience. The intersection of public pressure and personal vulnerability created fertile ground for introspection. Meghan began to articulate, in increasingly candid moments, the psychological toll of constant evaluation, the sense of living in a performative loop where authenticity was both demanded and constrained. She reflected on the dichotomy between public persona and private identity, exploring the consequences of decisions filtered through the lens of media, tradition, and expectation. These reflections were neither purely theoretical nor abstract. They shaped her emotional responsiveness, her perception of agency, and her openness to alternative sources of connection, including the subtle attentions of the billionaire. Harry's experience of public scrutiny was no less intense, though expressed differently. He faced the dual challenge of defending personal boundaries while maintaining relational support, balancing protective instincts with the need for empathetic understanding. Friends noted that his awareness of Meghan's vulnerability intensified his concern, yet also created moments of frustration and helplessness. The couple's dynamic became a continuous negotiation of visibility, trust, and emotional labor, a high-stakes relational calculus under the constant gaze of both media and public expectation. The strain of scrutiny extended beyond immediate perception to anticipated consequences. Meghan and Harry were acutely aware that any deviation from prescribed behavior, or even a misinterpreted alignment of attention, could trigger controversy, speculation, and social censure. This anticipation of judgment heightened emotional vigilance, increasing sensitivity to both real and perceived threats. The billionaire's presence, though indirect, became psychologically significant in this context. His attentiveness offered a contrast to the perpetual evaluation imposed by public life, highlighting spaces where Meghan could experience acknowledgement, understanding, and affirmation without immediate repercussion. Experts in public life and celebrity psychology observe that sustained scrutiny can alter decision-making processes, particularly when individuals perceive limited avenues for authentic engagement. Meghan's reflections, as reported by insiders, demonstrated heightened awareness of this effect. She recognized the tension between maintaining a public role and preserving personal integrity, evaluating the emotional and relational costs of compliance versus exploration. In this environment, subtle forms of influence, like the measured attention of the billionaire, gain amplified significance, shaping desires, priorities, and emotional responses. By the end of this period, the couple's private world had become increasingly defined by the interplay of scrutiny, vulnerability, and relational negotiation. The strain of constant observation, coupled with internal doubts and external allure, created a psychological landscape both delicate and volatile. Meghan's growing awareness of alternative emotional and intellectual validation, juxtaposed with the persistent demands of public life and marital commitment, set the stage for pivotal decisions and turning points. This chapter closes with a recognition that the pressures of visibility were not merely background noise. They were active forces shaping perception, emotion, and relational dynamics. The narrative tension between public obligation and private desire had reached a critical threshold, foreshadowing the intensification of the central dilemma, the intersection of loyalty, curiosity, and the allure of an alternative life that promised attention, autonomy, and understanding. It began as a whisper, a subtle ripple in Meghan's otherwise structured and predictable life. The Arab billionaire, whose name was increasingly present in discreet circles and occasional media murmurs, represented more than wealth or status. He embodied a possibility, a world untethered from the rigid constraints of royal expectation. His attention was persistent yet carefully calibrated, a psychological presence that Meghan sensed even in moments of apparent absence. Insiders described how this attention carried a duality, both flattering and destabilizing, an intoxicating mixture that could elicit admiration while quietly reshaping priorities. The billionaire's interactions were never overtly public, never crossing the boundaries of propriety in obvious ways, but the subtlety of influence can be more compelling than overt intrusion. Private messages, carefully worded compliments, and gestures of attentiveness created an emotional resonance that Meghan could not dismiss. Friends observed that she often lingered over these interactions, rereading communications, analyzing tone, and imagining the scenarios suggested by his attention. The psychological mechanism was clear. Reinforcement through selective engagement can magnify desire and curiosity, particularly when juxtaposed with a life constrained by expectation and visibility. Meghan's reflections on these interactions were complex. She oscillated between fascination and guilt, excitement and ethical reflection. The billionaire, though physically distant, became a psychological mirror, reflecting possibilities she felt were unavailable within her current environment. Friends described moments in which Meghan articulated her internal conflict in careful, nuanced language, revealing not only desire but also awareness of the stakes involved. She spoke of feeling understood, admired for qualities that she sensed were underappreciated in her immediate surroundings, and intellectually engaged in ways that had become rare. These private musings often carried an undercurrent of anxiety, a recognition that curiosity and loyalty were beginning to collide. Harry, perceptive to subtle changes in demeanor and tone, began to sense the shadow of influence even before its contours were fully clear. He noticed Meghan's eyes drifting, her attention lingering on unseen correspondences, and the occasional hesitation in verbal responses. While their conversations remained measured and loving, the tension was palpable, a silent acknowledgement of the widening gap between curiosity and commitment. Friends and insiders reported that Harry attempted to maintain connection through traditional means, engagement in shared planning, humor, and reminders of mutual history. Yet he increasingly felt that the invisible presence of the billionaire created a psychological wedge he could neither articulate nor remove. The interplay of attention, desire, and ethical tension unfolded over weeks and months. Meghan's private reflections, though internally disciplined, were continuously catalyzed by the billionaire's attentiveness. The dynamics resembled a psychological negotiation, balancing intrigue and curiosity against loyalty and social obligation. Each message, each discreet gesture, reinforced a narrative that Meghan was not only desired but also intellectually and emotionally understood in ways she craved. This was not merely flattery. It was carefully constructed attention that highlighted unmet needs, catalyzing both introspection and desire. Observers of the couple noted that this dynamic introduced a nuanced form of relational complexity. Unlike overt infidelity or dramatic confrontation, the influence of the billionaire operated through suggestion, emotional resonance, and selective validation. Meghan's internal deliberations were intense, reflective of the tension between private longing and public responsibility. Friends described her contemplations as methodical yet emotionally charged, as if navigating a psychological labyrinth with no clear exit. The allure of attention, coupled with the emotional resonance of being understood and admired, began to shift her perception of possibilities, subtly recalibrating her internal framework of desire, loyalty, and self-conception. Psychologists familiar with high-profile relational dynamics observe that such patterns are not uncommon. External attention, especially when emotionally and intellectually validating, can magnify latent curiosity or dissatisfaction. In Meghan's case, the billionaire's carefully measured engagement created a mirror for unexpressed desires, reinforcing both emotional curiosity and the perception of autonomy. The psychological tension was intensified by the constant visibility of her royal obligations, the scrutiny of media and public opinion, and the expectations embedded in marital and familial roles. Each layer compounded the complexity of decision-making, creating a high-stakes environment in which minor stimuli could provoke significant introspection and emotional fluctuation. As this period unfolded, Meghan began to articulate, in increasingly private and measured moments, the contours of her emotional response. She acknowledged both the ethical and relational stakes involved, the weight of loyalty and history, and the cognitive dissonance created by simultaneous attraction and commitment. These private confessions were marked by meticulous reflection, an awareness that desire and responsibility were colliding, that curiosity and ethical obligation were not easily reconciled, and that the next steps would require both courage and precision. Friends described her tone as urgent yet deliberate, a testament to the gravity of the internal calculus she was performing. The billionaire's shadow also influenced practical considerations. Discussions with advisors, friends, and close confidants reflected an increased awareness of alternative trajectories, what life could look like if boundaries were redrawn, priorities reassessed, and the invisible presence of desire made explicit. Meghan's thought processes encompassed not only emotional and relational elements, but also practical implications, social mobility, personal autonomy, and the symbolic power of decisions in both public and private spheres. Each consideration was intertwined with the subtle gravitational pull of attention and validation, creating a psychological ecosystem in which curiosity, ethics, and longing coexisted uneasily. By the conclusion of this period, the psychological landscape had transformed. The billionaire, though physically removed, had become a central figure in Meghan's internal narrative, a catalyst for reflection, desire, and tension. Harry's awareness of subtle shifts, combined with the relentless pressure of public life, created an environment where decisions could no longer be deferred without consequence. The stage was set for pivotal actions, choices that would challenge loyalties, test commitments, and redefine the relational terrain between curiosity and marital fidelity. The chapter closes with an acknowledgement of the silent but profound influence of attention and validation. Meghan's internal dialogue, shaped by both desire and ethical reflection, had reached a critical point. The invisible presence of the billionaire cast a shadow that was simultaneously alluring and destabilizing, setting the trajectory for the imminent intensification of decisions that would alter both her personal and relational landscape.